The email that almost ended my career was sent at 2:14 a.m. Japan Standard Time, while I was sitting alone in a hotel room overlooking Shinagawa Station in Tokyo, watching bullet trains blur past like they were trying to outrun something I couldn't see yet. It wasn't even sent to me. It was sent about me. I only know the exact time because Slack keeps receipts. And because that timestamp burned itself into my memory the moment I realized my entire team had been talking about me behind my back, coordinating how to let me take the fall, while smiling to my face and telling me they had my support. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already on foreign soil, my passport locked in a hotel safe, my boss using the distance from home like a weapon, and a thread labeled Tokyo Contingency spelling out in careful bullet points how to humiliate me in front of a client, document my instability, and push HR toward a termination for cause before I could even get back to the United States. I was the only one in the room who didn't know I'd already been decided on. And the worst part was that this wasn't some faceless corporation doing this to me. These were people I had eaten lunch with, people who had hugged me before the flight, people who told me at JFK International Airport in New York, right before boarding Japan Airlines Flight 5 to Tokyo Haneda, that they were proud of me. I believed them. I need to start earlier, before Tokyo, before Slack, before the embassy, before the emails that used words like risk, liability, and containment next to my name. I worked for Meridian Strategic Solutions, headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, with satellite offices in Austin, Texas, San Jose, California, and New York City. We were a mid-sized consulting firm that specialized in logistics optimization for manufacturing clients, the kind of work that never made headlines but quietly moved billions of dollars worth of goods every year. I was a senior project manager based out of the Chicago headquarters, working on the 23rd floor of 233 South Wacker Drive, right across from the Willis Tower. I had been there for 6 years, not 6 months, 6 years. Long enough to build systems, long enough to train people who later became my peers, long enough to believe I had earned a certain amount of trust. My direct manager was Kevin Monroe, a director in his mid-40s who had transferred from the San Jose office 2 years earlier. He liked to describe himself as globally minded, which mostly meant he liked overseas travel and reminding everyone that he had once lived in Singapore for 8 months. Our team was assigned a high-stakes client engagement with Takanashi Industrial Group, a Japanese manufacturing conglomerate headquartered in Minato City, Tokyo, with facilities across Honshu. Meridian had been trying to land this client for years. When we finally did, it was treated internally like a victory lap. The kickoff meeting was scheduled to take place in Tokyo over 3 weeks, with workshops at Takanashi's headquarters near Roppongi Hills, site visits in Yokohama, and final presentations at their satellite office in Kawasaki. Kevin insisted I lead the on-site engagement. He told me it was because I had the strongest relationship with the client-side operations team. He told me it was because I was steady. He told me it was because this was a visibility opportunity. What he did not tell me was that he had already decided I would be the scapegoat if anything went wrong. In the weeks leading up to the trip, my team held daily prep calls. There were 6 of us, me, Kevin, 2 consultants based in Austin named Mark and Alicia, a data analyst in San Jose named Trevor, and a junior associate in New York named Lauren. Every call ended the same way. "We've got your back," Mark would say. "You're going to crush it," Alicia added. "Just tell us what you need," Trevor said. Even Kevin played the part. He praised my deck drafts. He approved my workshop agendas. He told me, explicitly, that if the client pushed back on scope or timeline, he would step in. "Don't worry," he said during our final prep meeting in Conference Room 23B in Chicago. "This is on me too." I boarded the flight believing that. We flew out of JFK because Kevin wanted the team to travel together, even though I lived in Chicago. I took a connecting flight from O'Hare to New York the night before, stayed at the TWA hotel at JFK, and met the rest of the team in the terminal the next morning. At the gate, Kevin made a show of introducing us to the airline staff as the Chicago team heading to Tokyo. He joked about jet lag. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Our fearless leader." That was the last honest thing he said to me for weeks. We landed at Haneda Airport after 14 hours in the air. The humidity hit me the moment we stepped outside customs. A Meridian-arranged car took us to the Intercontinental Tokyo Bay, where the company had booked rooms overlooking the Sumida River. The hotel was clean, quiet, professional. The kind of place meant to make you feel safe and competent. The first week went well. Workshops ran on time. The client asked smart questions. I fielded concerns, adjusted timelines, documented risks. Kevin sat quietly during most meetings, letting me handle the room. But subtle things started to shift. In the second week, during a planning session in Takanashi's 8th floor conference room in Minato City, Kevin contradicted me in front of the client for the first time. I said a data integration phase would require an additional 2 weeks to meet compliance standards. Kevin smiled and said, "We'll find a way to accelerate that." The client looked relieved. I looked confused. After the meeting, I pulled Kevin aside near the elevator bank. "That's not realistic," I said. "We talked about this." He nodded. "We'll figure it out. Don't make it a thing." He started scheduling side meetings without me. Brief check-ins with Mark and Alicia at the hotel bar. Late night, Slack messages that I wasn't tagged in. When I asked for updates, I got vague answers. Just alignment stuff. Nothing major. Kevin wanted to sanity check something. By the third week, the pressure escalated. The client asked for a revised delivery plan that cut our original timeline by almost 30%. I pushed back, citing regulatory risks. Kevin told me, in front of the client's executive committee, that I was being overly cautious. The room went quiet. Afterward, Kevin took me aside in the hallway outside conference room Sakura at Takanashi's headquarters. "You need to read the room," he said. "This is Japan. Harmony matters." I reminded him that compliance also mattered. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me handle the politics." That night, back at the Intercontinental, I opened Slack to catch up on messages. That's when I noticed a channel I'd never seen before. It was archived but still visible. #Tokyo Contingency. My name appeared in the description. I clicked. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a misnamed planning thread. Maybe an old joke. Then I started scrolling. Messages from Kevin. From Mark. From Alicia. From Trevor. All time-stamped over the last 10 days. They were discussing me like a problem to be managed. Kevin had written, "If she pushes back again tomorrow, we document resistance." Mark replied, agreed. "Client already seems frustrated." Alicia added, "HR will need a clean narrative. Emphasize cultural misalignment." Trevor asked, "Do we loop legal now or wait until she's back stateside?" There were screenshots of my emails, commentary on my tone, speculation about my emotional stability under pressure. Someone had written, "Foreign travel amplifies stress. We can frame this as concern." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, scrolling through pages of coordination I was never meant to see. They were planning to undermine me in real time, in a country where I didn't speak the language, thousands of miles from home, with my manager controlling the narrative. And then I saw the message that changed everything. Kevin wrote, "If this escalates, we can involve the U.S. Embassy liaison. Frame it as duty of care." I knew then that this wasn't just about my job. This was about control. And it was already in motion. I closed my laptop. I didn't sleep. The next morning, we had a final executive presentation scheduled at Takanashi's Kawasaki office. Kevin took the lead. He presented slides I had never approved. He blamed delays on internal recalibration. He used phrases like misalignment at the project management level. He looked at me when he said it. After the meeting, I received an email from Meridian HR, sent from the Chicago office, requesting a brief check-in call. The subject line read, concerns regarding Tokyo engagement. I was still in Japan, and my team was already done pretending. The HR call was scheduled for 9 a.m. Central Time, which meant it rang my phone at 11 p.m. in Tokyo. I was sitting at the small desk by the window in my hotel room, laptop open, Slack minimized but not forgotten. I let the phone ring twice before answering, mostly to steady my voice. I already knew this wouldn't be a casual check-in. Meridian didn't schedule brief calls across 13 time zones unless something had already been framed, summarized, and approved. "Hi, this is Karen Patel from Human Resources," the woman said. Her voice was calm in the way HR voices always are, practiced and neutral. "Thanks for making time so late in your day." I told her it was fine. It wasn't. Kevin was already on the line. I hadn't been told he would be. His presence was the first confirmation that this was coordinated. Karen explained that concerns had been raised about my conduct during the Tokyo engagement. She emphasized that this was not disciplinary, that Meridian took employee well-being abroad very seriously, and that the goal was to understand all perspectives. Then she started listing specifics: client discomfort, resistance to leadership direction, tone issues in executive settings, emotional responses under pressure. Each point sounded eerily familiar, lifted almost word for word from the Slack messages I'd read the night before. I responded carefully. I referenced emails. I referenced meeting notes. I referenced the project scope document that Kevin himself had signed in Chicago. I explained the regulatory risks. I explained the client's internal politics, which I had spent weeks navigating successfully. Kevin didn't contradict me directly. He didn't have to. Every time I finished a sentence, he added a qualifier, like, "What she means is, to be fair, in context." Karen listened. She took notes. She asked if I felt safe continuing the engagement. That word made my stomach tighten. Safe. I said yes. Of course I felt safe. I was doing my job. Karen paused, then said Meridian had a duty of care obligation for employees working overseas. She said they wanted to make sure stress wasn't impairing judgment. She said if needed, they could explore support options, including an early return to the U.S. Kevin jumped in. "That might be best," he said, "for everyone." The call ended with no resolution, just a promise to revisit tomorrow. I sat there long after the line went dead, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. Tokyo hummed below me, indifferent. I had never felt so alone in a crowded city. The next morning, Kevin told me he wanted to handle the remaining client communications himself. "Why?" I asked, standing in the hotel lobby near the concierge desk. "Let's just reduce friction," he said. "Focus on wrapping up documentation." He said it like he was doing me a favor. I emailed Karen after breakfast, summarizing my concerns and formally requesting copies of any complaints lodged against me. I CC'd my personal email address. I had learned, painfully, that transparency mattered only when you created your own record. By noon, I received a response that chilled me. Karen wrote that due to the sensitivity of the situation, Meridian had contacted its global mobility partner and the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo as a precaution. She assured me this was standard protocol. It wasn't. The embassy email arrived an hour later. Official, polite, procedural. It requested a meeting to discuss employer-reported concerns and ensure appropriate support. Kevin forwarded it to me with a single line, "Let's attend together." I didn't reply. The embassy meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at the U.S. Embassy in Minato City, a concrete fortress tucked behind layers of security and quiet streets. I arrived alone. Kevin had texted that he was running late. A consular officer named Michael escorted me into a small conference room. He explained that Meridian had flagged concerns about my well-being and professional conduct while abroad. He asked if I was under unusual stress. He asked if I felt coerced or unsafe. I answered honestly. I said I felt undermined. I said I felt misrepresented. I said my employer was escalating a workplace dispute into something it wasn't. Michael nodded. He took notes. He asked if I had documentation. I did. I showed him the Slack channel. That changed everything. He excused himself for 10 minutes. When he returned, his tone had shifted. More formal. More cautious. "This is not a consular issue," he said carefully. "This appears to be an internal employment matter." He asked if I wished to leave Japan early. I said no. I asked if Meridian could force me. He said no, not legally, but companies sometimes pressured employees by framing situations as risk management. Kevin never showed up. That night, I received another email from HR. This one included legal. They were placing me on temporary administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation. They instructed me not to contact the client, not to access Meridian systems beyond email, and to return to the U.S. within 48 hours. The language was cold. Final. I booked my own flight. Japan Airlines Haneda to O'Hare with a layover in Los Angeles. Meridian didn't offer assistance. They didn't even pretend. At Haneda Airport, standing in the departure terminal, I watched my Slack account deactivate. Channels disappeared one by one. 6 years of work reduced to a blinking cursor and a login error. When I landed in Chicago, it was raining. The city looked the same. I didn't. 2 days later, I received a formal notice of investigation. Allegations included insubordination, failure to align with leadership, and reputational risk to the firm. Kevin submitted a statement. So did Mark. So did Alicia. None of them mentioned the Slack channel. I hired an employment attorney in downtown Chicago. Her office overlooked the river. She read everything silently, then looked up at me and said, "They overplayed this." She filed a response. She demanded preservation of records. She requested Slack archives. Meridian stalled. Then they complied. What came out was worse than I imagined. There were additional channels, regional leadership threads, comments about managing optics, discussions about using Japan's cultural norms to portray me as aggressive, emails where Kevin referred to me as unstable abroad, HR notes that predated the trip. They had decided before the plane took off. The investigation dragged on for weeks. I didn't retaliate. I didn't leak anything. I let the facts speak. And slowly the tone shifted. HR stopped copying Kevin. Legal started asking questions. Kevin was placed on leave. Then, quietly, he resigned. Meridian offered me a settlement. Confidential. Generous. Conditional on silence. I declined the silence. I returned to work under a different manager. My reputation repaired but altered. I wasn't naive anymore. Tokyo still appears in my dreams sometimes. Not the skyline. Not the trains. The Slack channel. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about visibility. About understanding how easily support becomes strategy when power feels threatened. And about never assuming the people smiling at the gate are on your side. When Kevin resigned, Meridian didn't announce it. There was no all-hands email. No farewell message. No explanation. His calendar simply disappeared, his name removed from the org chart like it had never been there in the first place. People noticed, but no one asked questions out loud. That's how companies survive things like this. Quiet erasure. I found out because my attorney forwarded me a short email from Meridian Legal confirming his voluntary separation. The wording was careful. Too careful. What followed was not relief. It was a slow, grinding realization that the story wasn't over just because the person who started it had exited the building. HR scheduled another call. This one was during normal business hours. Chicago time. That detail alone told me something had shifted. Karen was still there, but she sounded different. Less scripted. Less certain. She said the investigation had uncovered process failures and communication breakdowns. She said Meridian wanted to move forward constructively. She said they valued my contributions and hoped I could reintegrate smoothly. I asked her directly whether the allegations against me had been substantiated. There was a pause. No, she said. They have not. I asked if that would be documented in my personnel file. Yes, she said quickly. Too quickly. I asked if the embassy involvement had been appropriate. Another pause. That aspect is under internal review. That was corporate language, for we know it crossed a line. They offered me reinstatement to my role, reporting to a new director based out of the Austin office. They offered back pay for the weeks I had been placed on administrative leave. They offered an additional retention bonus, framed as goodwill. What they didn't offer was an apology. I took the reinstatement. I declined the bonus. I told them in writing that any future overseas travel would require advance documentation of escalation protocols and decision authority. They agreed. My first day back in the Chicago office felt unreal. The 23rd floor looked the same. The view of the Willis Tower hadn't changed, but people moved differently around me. Some avoided eye contact. Some smiled too hard. A few pulled me aside to say things like, "I heard it got intense," or "glad you're back," without asking why I'd been gone. Mark sent me a Slack message. Just one line. "Hey, hope you're okay." I didn't respond. Alicia blocked me on LinkedIn. Trevor sent an email apologizing if anything came across wrong. It was vague enough to be meaningless. Lauren, the junior associate, stopped by my desk on my second day back. She looked nervous. She told me she had been told not to speak to me during the investigation. She said she hadn't known about the Slack channels. I believed her. She didn't have the rank to be included. I told her it wasn't her fault. What unsettled me most was how normal everything tried to be. Meetings resumed. Deadlines returned. Clients needed updates. Meridian expected me to perform as if my career hadn't been quietly dismantled and then reassembled behind closed doors. 2 weeks after my return, I was asked to brief senior leadership on lessons learned from the Tokyo engagement. The meeting took place in the executive conference room on the 25th floor, a glass-walled space overlooking the Chicago River. The same room where Kevin had once praised my leadership in front of the partners. Now his chair was empty. The audience included the COO, the head of HR, and 2 managing partners from the San Jose and New York offices. Karen was there, seated slightly apart. I prepared carefully. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I laid out a timeline. I showed documentation. I explained how ambiguity in authority had been exploited. I explained how cultural context had been used selectively, not respectfully. I said something that made the room go very quiet. When escalation mechanisms are controlled by the same individual who benefits from discrediting a subordinate, I said, they stop being safeguards and start being weapons. No one interrupted me. After the meeting, the COO thanked me. He said my professionalism had been noted. He said Meridian was reviewing its overseas assignment policies. I nodded. I didn't thank him back. A month later, Meridian announced changes to its international travel protocols. Dual reporting lines, independent HR check-ins, explicit limits on manager authority during foreign assignments. Kevin's name was never mentioned. Privately, my attorney advised me to document everything for the next year. She said retaliation didn't always look like termination. Sometimes it looked like stalled advancement, missed opportunities, quiet sidelining. She wasn't wrong. I noticed that my name stopped coming up for high-visibility projects. Not explicitly, just subtly. Projects went to others. Travel opportunities were reconsidered. Leadership spoke to me warmly, but cautiously, like I was something fragile they didn't want to break again. I had become a liability in a different way. 6 months after Tokyo, Meridian was approached by an external auditor. A routine compliance review triggered by an unrelated client complaint. But audits have a way of widening. The auditors requested documentation related to overseas engagements, HR escalation records, and communications involving employee well-being abroad. My attorney called me the moment she heard. "They're reopening the door," she said. "And this time, Meridian doesn't control the narrative." The auditors requested interviews. Mine was scheduled at their downtown office on LaSalle Street. I told the same story, calmly, with receipts. They asked about the Slack channels. I showed them. They asked about the embassy involvement. I explained how it had been framed to me. I provided emails. They asked if I felt coerced into returning early. "Yes," I said. "I was told it was not optional." That wasn't entirely true, but it was how it felt. And feelings matter in investigations. 3 weeks later, Meridian received a preliminary findings report. I didn't see it directly, but Karen called me in, face pale, voice tight. She said the auditors had identified serious governance concerns. She said there would be follow-up inquiries. She said Meridian was cooperating fully. She asked if I would be willing to participate further. I said yes. That decision changed my relationship with the company permanently. Leadership stopped treating me like someone to be managed and started treating me like someone they couldn't afford to antagonize. My role was adjusted. I was moved into an internal advisory position focused on risk mitigation and compliance. It wasn't a promotion, but it was influence. Mark left the company quietly 2 months later. Alicia transferred to a different firm. Trevor stayed, but his career stalled. None of them ever acknowledged what they had done. I didn't confront them. There was no dramatic showdown, no revenge, just consequences unfolding at their own pace. A year after Tokyo, I stood in a different airport. Chicago O'Hare, Terminal 3. This time, I was flying to Frankfurt for a short advisory engagement. Different company now. I had left Meridian 3 months earlier on my own terms with a strong reference and a clean exit. As I waited to board, I thought about how easily everything could have ended differently. How close I had come to being labeled unstable, uncooperative, expendable. All because I trusted the wrong version of support. I don't tell the story because I won. I tell it because the system almost did. And because somewhere, someone else is probably sitting in a hotel room right now, scrolling through messages they were never meant to see, realizing too late that the room turned against them while they were still in it. That's the part people don't talk about. Leaving Meridian should have felt like closure. It didn't. I gave 4 weeks' notice. Not 2. 4. Professional to the end. My resignation email was calm, appreciative, careful. I thanked them for the opportunities. I cited long-term career alignment. I avoided words like trust, safety, or Tokyo. They accepted it within an hour. Karen scheduled an exit interview. She framed it as optional. It wasn't. Not really. Companies don't let people like me walk out without one last attempt to shape the narrative. The interview took place in a small HR conference room on the 21st floor, windowless, beige, deliberately neutral. Karen was there. So was a man from legal I hadn't met before. His name was Thomas. He didn't smile. They asked why I was leaving. I told them the truth, but not the whole truth. I said the Tokyo engagement had clarified how exposed project leads could be when escalation paths were compromised. I said I wanted to work somewhere where governance wasn't reactive. I said I didn't feel Meridian was structurally prepared to protect employees when power dynamics shifted under pressure. Thomas asked if I believed Meridian had retaliated against me. I chose my words carefully. I believe Meridian struggled to respond appropriately once it realized the situation was not what had been reported internally. Karen wrote something down. Thomas asked if I planned to pursue further action. No, I said. I'm moving on. That was true. Mostly. My new role was with a logistics risk advisory firm based in Boston, Massachusetts, with offices in Frankfurt and Singapore. They had recruited me quietly through a former colleague who had followed the Tokyo situation more closely than most. They didn't ask invasive questions. They didn't minimize what happened. They asked how I would redesign escalation systems if I had full authority. That's how I knew it was the right move. Still, Meridian didn't fully let go. 2 weeks after my last day, I received an email from an internal compliance mailbox I no longer had access to. Someone had forwarded it to my personal address by mistake. It was a thread discussing legacy exposure related to the Tokyo engagement. My name was referenced, but not as the problem, as the witness. They were preparing for potential regulatory scrutiny tied to duty of care misrepresentation and misuse of embassy resources. The external auditors had escalated their findings. Meridian was now answering questions from their insurers. Kevin's resignation had not been the end. It had been the beginning. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my attorney. She smiled when she read it. "They're cleaning up," she said. "That means the mess was real." I started my new job in Boston in early October. The office was on Summer Street, overlooking Fort Point Channel. Smaller, quieter, less performative. My title was Principal Advisor, International Operations Risk. The irony wasn't lost on me. On my second week, I was asked to review a draft travel policy for client-facing teams assigned overseas. I read it carefully. I marked it up heavily. I added language about independent reporting, about documentation ownership, about prohibiting unilateral escalation to embassies or local authorities without employee consent unless there was an imminent safety threat. When I returned the draft, the managing partner emailed me back. "This is strong," he wrote. "Where did you learn all this?" I didn't answer that question directly. Around that time, I started receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A former Meridian consultant, now working in Denver, asked if I'd be willing to talk. She said she'd been placed on a performance plan after disagreeing with a director during a client engagement in Mexico City. Another woman reached out on LinkedIn. She had been pulled off a project in Dubai after reporting harassment. She wanted to know how I had survived being labeled difficult without it ending her career. I didn't give them scripts. I didn't give them tactics. I told them to document, to preserve records, to understand who controlled escalation before agreeing to travel. I told them to trust facts more than reassurance. Then, unexpectedly, Kevin resurfaced. Not directly, not to me. He filed a complaint. 3 months after his resignation, Kevin submitted a wrongful termination claim against Meridian, alleging constructive dismissal and reputational harm. He claimed he had been pressured to resign following the Tokyo engagement and that leadership had scapegoated him to appease auditors. Meridian's legal department panicked. My attorney called me as soon as she heard. "He's trying to rewrite history," she said, "and you're in the middle of it." Meridian requested my cooperation as a witness, informally at first, then formally. I wasn't obligated. I had no ongoing employment relationship, but my attorney advised me to participate under controlled conditions. The deposition was scheduled in Chicago at a law firm near the Loop. I flew in the night before and stayed at a hotel I chose myself, not one arranged by anyone else. The room was quiet, safe, mine. The deposition lasted 6 hours. Kevin was in the room, across the table. He looked thinner, older, less certain. He avoided my eyes. His attorney asked questions designed to frame him as overwhelmed, unsupported, pressured by leadership to manage an impossible client engagement. When it was my turn to answer questions, I stayed factual. I described the Slack channels, the timing, the language, the planning. I described the embassy email, who initiated it, how it was framed to me. I described how Kevin contradicted me publicly, then documented that contradiction as evidence of my resistance. Kevin's attorney objected frequently. It didn't matter. At one point, Kevin spoke up directly. "That's not how I remember it," he said. I looked at him then, really looked. "I'm sure," I said, "but the records don't rely on memory." The deposition ended with no drama, no raised voices, just exhaustion. Weeks later, Meridian settled with Kevin. Confidential terms. No admission of wrongdoing. Kevin disappeared again. That should have been the end. But the story had one more turn. In early spring, nearly 2 years after Tokyo, I received a call from the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Not the same officer. A different department. They were conducting an internal review of corporate referrals made during overseas employee disputes. My case had been flagged during an audit. They asked if I would be willing to provide a statement about how the embassy involvement had been initiated and presented to me. I agreed. The call was calm, professional, apologetic in a way government agencies rarely are. The officer told me that embassy resources were not meant to be used as leverage in employment disputes, that Meridian's framing had been misleading, that procedural safeguards had since been reinforced. It didn't undo what happened, but it mattered. After the call, I sat at my desk in Boston and stared out at the water. Boats moved slowly through the channel. People walked dogs along the path. Life continued, indifferent to corporate fallout. I thought about the version of myself who had boarded that flight at JFK, trusting the smiles, the reassurances, the language of support. I thought about how easily competence can be reframed as defiance when power feels threatened. And I understood something I hadn't before. What happened to me wasn't exceptional. It was just documented. After the embassy call, I stopped telling myself that what happened in Tokyo was over. It was finished in the sense that the immediate damage had been contained. My job wasn't gone. My reputation wasn't destroyed. No one was actively trying to erase me anymore. But the ripple effects were still moving outward, touching places I hadn't anticipated. I started seeing patterns. At my new firm in Boston, I sat in on a risk review for a client with operations in Sao Paulo. A junior manager raised concerns about local labor law exposure. Her director brushed it aside, saying, "Let's not complicate things." The room went quiet. I recognized the moment instantly. The subtle pressure to align. The unspoken warning that pushing further would mark her as a problem. After the meeting, she pulled me aside and asked carefully how far was too far when disagreeing with leadership. I didn't give her a motivational speech. I told her what I wished someone had told me years earlier. Disagreement isn't the risk, I said. Unrecorded disagreement is. She nodded like something had clicked. Around the same time, I received a formal letter from Meridian's legal counsel. Not hostile, not threatening, informational. They were notifying me that certain documents related to the Tokyo engagement had been reclassified as part of an internal compliance archive. They thanked me for my cooperation during prior inquiries. They reminded me of my ongoing confidentiality obligations. The letter didn't scare me. It confirmed something instead. Meridian was still dealing with the consequences. Through industry contacts, I learned that their insurers had raised premiums for overseas assignments. That clients had started asking pointed questions about governance after hearing whispers. That HR leadership had quietly changed. None of it was public. None of it had my name attached. But it was happening. What surprised me most was how often people assumed I must feel vindicated. They'd say things like, "Well, at least you won," or "That must feel satisfying." It didn't. What I felt was clarity, and a low, persistent anger that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with how easily systems can be bent when no one is watching. The Tokyo Slack channel still existed in my head. Not the words, exactly, but the casualness. The way decisions about my livelihood had been discussed like logistics. The way concern had been weaponized. That stayed with me. About a year into my role in Boston, my firm was retained by a multinational client headquartered in Seattle, Washington. They were facing internal unrest after a senior manager accused leadership of sidelining her during an overseas expansion in Kuala Lumpur. The parallels were obvious. I was asked to lead the internal review. The meetings took place in a glass building near Pike Place Market. Clean, modern, full of words like transparency and values printed on the walls. The accused executive insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that cultural differences had been misread, that the manager was overwhelmed abroad. I listened. I took notes. I asked for records. There was a Slack channel, not hidden, just overlooked. It contained planning notes about managing perception, about documenting emotional volatility, about keeping communications need to know. When I presented my findings, I didn't dramatize them. I laid them out line by line. I explained how intent mattered, less than effect. How governance gaps created plausible deniability until they didn't. The client's board thanked me. The executive was placed on leave pending further review. Afterward, one of the board members asked me how I had recognized the issue so quickly. I told him the truth. I've seen what it looks like from the inside. That case made its way into my firm's internal training materials. Anonymized, sanitized, but present. I became known as the person who asked uncomfortable questions before things exploded. That reputation carried weight. It also came with cost. I was no longer invited into rooms to smooth things over. I was brought in when things were already tense, when leadership wanted cover, when risk had materialized. I accepted that trade-off. One evening, while reviewing documents at home, I received a message from Lauren, the junior associate from Meridian. We hadn't spoken since she stopped by my desk years earlier. She had left Meridian. She was working for a different firm now, based in Minneapolis. She said she wanted to thank me for showing me what not to ignore, she wrote. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. You didn't need me for that, I wrote back. You were already paying attention. She told me that during her last year at Meridian, she had noticed similar Slack channels forming around other employees. She had documented them. Quietly, she had left before becoming a target. I didn't want to be brave, she wrote. I just didn't want to be blind. I understood that. The longer I stayed in this work, the more I realized how rarely people set out to ruin someone. Most of the time, they just prioritize comfort, alignment, the absence of friction. And when someone threatens that, even unintentionally, the system reacts. 2 years after Tokyo, I was invited to speak on a panel at a professional conference in San Diego, California. The topic was duty of care in global assignments. I almost declined. Public visibility still made me uneasy. I didn't like being seen as a cautionary tale, but my firm encouraged it. Carefully. No names. No specifics. The panel took place in a hotel ballroom overlooking the harbor. I spoke last. I talked about process, about clarity, about not conflating discomfort with danger. I didn't mention Japan, or Meridian, or Kevin, but afterward a woman approached me. She introduced herself as an HR director from a healthcare company in New Jersey. She said quietly, "We did this to someone once." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. "I'm trying to make sure we never do it again," she said. That mattered more than any settlement ever could. On my flight home from San Diego, I watched the coastline disappear beneath the clouds and thought about how close I had come to losing everything without ever understanding why. How many people never get the chance to see the Slack channel, or the email, or the note that explains it all? They just disappear from the company website, from meetings, from relevance. I wasn't special because I survived. I was lucky because I found proof, and because I didn't panic when the system expected me to. That distinction changed how I moved through the world. It changed how I listened, and it changed how I defined support. By the 3rd year after Tokyo, the story had settled into something quieter, not forgotten, not resolved in a way that felt clean, just absorbed into the background noise of my life, like a low-frequency hum you stop noticing until it changes. I had stopped flinching when people mentioned overseas travel. I had stopped rereading old emails looking for signs I'd missed. I had even stopped dreaming about Slack notifications lighting up my phone in the middle of the night. What I hadn't stopped doing was watching. At my firm, governance conversations had become more formal, more structured. Not because people were suddenly more ethical, but because risk had names now. Examples: case studies, unspoken ones. One afternoon, my managing partner asked me to review a potential client engagement in Seoul, South Korea. The project involved a turnaround at a struggling subsidiary. High stress, high visibility, travel heavy. As I scanned the proposal, I noticed something immediately. The escalation protocol listed the regional managing director as the sole decision-maker for employee conduct issues abroad. I flagged it. "This is a problem," I said during the review meeting. "It concentrates too much power in one role." There was resistance. Polite, measured, professional. "We trust our leaders," someone said. "So did I replied. No one laughed. No one argued. They revised it. That moment felt small. It wasn't. It was the difference between a system learning and one repeating itself. Around that time, I received another unexpected call. This one from a journalist. She was working on a long-form piece about corporate use of diplomatic channels during international disputes. She had come across a reference to an anonymized case involving Tokyo, an American consulting firm, and an embassy referral that had been flagged internally. She asked if I would be willing to speak off the record. I declined, not because I was afraid, but because the story no longer belonged to me alone. It had moved into policy, into training manuals, into quiet changes that would never be attributed to a single person. Public exposure would have simplified it into heroes and villains. The reality was Messier. Kevin wasn't a monster. He was a manager who believed control equaled competence. Meridian wasn't evil. It was reactive, hierarchical, and afraid of admitting mistakes under pressure. That didn't excuse what happened, but it explained how it could happen again. Instead of the interview, I wrote a private memo for my firm, a synthesis of patterns I had observed across multiple cases. How power concentrates, how concern becomes pretext, how distance amplifies vulnerability. They circulated it internally. No names, no dates, just mechanisms. That was enough. Late that summer, I attended a small dinner in Cambridge with professionals from various industries. Policy, consulting, tech, academia. The conversation drifted to workplace accountability. Someone mentioned how rare it was for internal investigations to actually protect individuals. I listened more than I spoke. When someone asked if I'd ever seen it work, I said yes. They leaned in. "Only when documentation outruns narrative," I said. That line followed me longer than I expected. It showed up in a slide deck weeks later, then in a training session, then in an internal newsletter, unattributed. I didn't claim it. I didn't need to. Around this time, Meridian announced a merger. Different name, different branding, same core leadership, reshuffled. I read about it in a trade publication. The article praised their renewed focus on governance and global compliance. I closed the tab. It wasn't my responsibility to track their redemption arc. One evening, after work, I walked along the Charles River. The sun was setting, turning the water orange and gray. Runners passed me. A couple sat on a bench, arguing quietly. I thought about how many decisions that shape our lives are made in rooms we never enter, in channels we're never invited to. How often the story of someone's career is decided not by their performance, but by how inconvenient they become. I thought about the Slack channel again, not with anger this time, with clarity. The channel wasn't the betrayal. The betrayal was how normal it felt to them. That realization had changed how I measured trust, not by words, not by reassurances, by structure. Who has the power to decide? Who documents? Who benefits from ambiguity? Those questions followed me everywhere. A few months later, I was asked to mentor a small group of women at my firm, high performers, mid-career, the ones people describe as promising. We met in a conference room on a Friday afternoon. No agenda, just conversation. They asked about my career path, about mistakes, about turning points. One of them asked, hesitantly, if I'd ever been in a situation where support vanished when things got difficult. I didn't give details. I didn't need to. Yes, I said. And it taught me something important. They waited. Support that isn't written down isn't support, I said. It's atmosphere. And atmosphere changes. They wrote that down. I hoped they never needed it. The final echo of Tokyo came unexpectedly, in the form of an email from my attorney. She was cleaning up old files, preparing to archive my case permanently. She asked if I wanted copies of everything before she did. I said yes. That weekend, I opened the folder on my laptop. Emails, memos, Slack exports, deposition transcripts. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to. I scrolled until I found the first message in the Tokyo contingency channel. Kevin's initial note. Casual. Strategic. Calm. If this goes sideways, we need options. I closed the folder. It had gone sideways, just not the way he planned. And I realized something else, something quieter but more enduring. The story didn't end when he resigned. It ended when I stopped needing it to. By the time I stopped thinking of Tokyo as a wound and started thinking of it as a reference point, enough distance had passed that people assumed I was past it. That's the phrase they use when a story no longer makes them uncomfortable. Past it. As if experiences like that are something you walk away from, instead of something that quietly rewires how you evaluate rooms, conversations, promises. I was past the shock, past the fear, past the need to be believed. What I wasn't past was the awareness. It showed up in small, almost boring ways. In meetings, I watched who summarized conversations afterward and who didn't. I watched whose words were paraphrased and whose were quoted verbatim. I noticed when someone said, "Let's take this offline," and who was suddenly excluded from the follow-up. I noticed when concern appeared before documentation. Those patterns never stopped mattering. About 4 years after Tokyo, my firm was retained by a multinational energy company headquartered in Houston, Texas. They were preparing to send a senior operations lead to Lagos for a 6-month engagement tied to infrastructure upgrades. High profile, politically sensitive, risk-heavy. They wanted a pre-deployment review. I flew to Houston and met with their executive team in a glass tower downtown. The conference room overlooked the city. Bright, confident, the kind of space designed to project control. They walked me through their travel protocols, emergency contacts, security briefings, local partnerships. It all looked solid. Then I asked one question. If there's a dispute about leadership decisions on the ground, I said, who decides whether it's a performance issue or a safety issue? The room shifted. The head of HR answered carefully. That would be escalated through regional leadership. And who defines escalation? I asked. Another pause. Ultimately, the regional VP. I nodded. I didn't argue. I asked them to pull up a hypothetical. What if the regional VP is the one being challenged? I asked, what if the disagreement is about compliance? Silence. No one liked the question, but no one dismissed it either. They asked me to draft a revision. I did. It included an independent escalation channel, external review triggers, clear documentation ownership. When I sent it back, the CEO replied personally. This is uncomfortable, he wrote, which tells me it's necessary. That email stayed with me, not because it validated me, but because it showed how rarely organizations hear questions they haven't already prepared to answer. Around that same time, I was invited to join a closed working group advising a professional association on global assignment standards. Policy-level work. Slow. Incremental. In one of the sessions, someone referenced a known incident involving misuse of embassy resources during an internal dispute. They didn't name it. They didn't need to. The room understood. That's when I realized the story had outgrown me. It wasn't my story anymore. It was a data point, a cautionary example folded into policy language and footnotes. That was strangely comforting. It meant the damage hadn't been contained by silence. It had been transformed into friction against future mistakes. I thought back to the woman who had approached me in San Diego, the HR director who said, "We did this to someone once." I wondered how many companies had similar ghosts. Not scandals, just quiet casualties, people who didn't have screenshots, or attorneys, or timing on their side, people who were simply removed, explained away, replaced. The system didn't need villains. It only needed momentum. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I received a message from someone I didn't recognize. A name, a Gmail address. She said she'd been referred to me by a colleague. She was a project lead at a pharmaceutical firm in New Jersey. She had been asked to relocate temporarily to Zurich to support a regulatory submission. She was excited, nervous, proud, but something felt off. Her manager had insisted on being the sole point of contact for any issues. HR had deferred to him. Documentation was light. She asked if she was overthinking it. I read her message twice before replying. No, I wrote, "You're noticing it." I asked what had been put in writing. "Very little," she admitted. I told her to request clarity before she traveled. In writing, calmly, framed as alignment. She did. 2 days later, the tone changed. The trip was postponed. The structure was revised. A second reporting line was added. She thanked me profusely. I told her she'd done the work herself. That interaction mattered more to me than any public acknowledgement ever could. It meant the awareness was transferable, that it didn't require trauma to activate. Not everyone appreciated that kind of awareness. I had colleagues who thought I was overly cautious, who joked that I saw risk everywhere, who believed good intentions were enough. I didn't argue with them. Experience doesn't need to convince anyone. It just waits. In quieter moments, I sometimes thought about Kevin, not with anger, not with curiosity, with distance. I wondered if he had ever admitted to himself how close he had come to succeeding, how easily the plan could have worked if I hadn't seen that Slack channel, if I had reacted emotionally, if I had trusted reassurance instead of records. That realization was unsettling, because it meant the difference between disappearance and survival hadn't been merit. It had been timing and documentation. That understanding stripped the experience of its personal edge and revealed its structural core. It wasn't about me being targeted. It was about me being convenient. That's a harder truth, and a more useful one. Years later, when I was asked to contribute to a white paper on ethical leadership in multinational organizations, I included a single line in the draft. Abuse of process rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as concern. The editors didn't push back. They left it in. I didn't sign my name to that line. I didn't need to. On a cold morning in January, I stood in Logan Airport, waiting to board a flight to London for a short advisory engagement. Routine, predictable, controlled. As I watched people line up at the gate, I noticed a woman standing alone, scrolling through her phone, her expression tense. I didn't know her. I never would. But I recognized the posture. The way someone looks when they're trying to reassure themselves that everything is fine. I hoped it was. And if it wasn't, I hoped she'd ask the right questions early enough to change the outcome. That's the thing no one tells you. Most workplace disasters don't begin with cruelty. They begin with convenience. And they continue because no one interrupts the pattern before it hardens into precedent. Tokyo taught me that, not in the moment, but in everything that came after. I used to think the most dangerous moment in my career was the night I opened that Slack channel in Tokyo. I don't anymore. The most dangerous moment was the one before that. The one where I still believed support meant loyalty, where reassurance felt like protection, where I assumed systems existed to prevent abuse rather than quietly enable it when the wrong person controlled them. That belief is comfortable. It's also fragile. Years have passed since Tokyo. Enough that the city itself feels distant now, reduced to a set of coordinates in my memory. Haneda Airport, Shinagawa Station, the Intercontinental overlooking the river. Takanashi's conference rooms in Minato City and Kawasaki. The embassy compound with its concrete walls and polite voices. They exist. They're real. But they're no longer the center of the story. The center is what came after. The quiet recalibration. The way my attention sharpened. The way I stopped equating professionalism with silence. The way I learned to listen for what wasn't being written down. I didn't become cynical. I became precise. Today, when people ask about my career, they frame it in terms of resilience. They say things like, "You handled that well," or "You came out stronger." I don't correct them, but that's not how it felt. It felt like adaptation, like learning a new language you didn't ask to speak, but now can't unhear. I didn't win anything in Tokyo. I didn't expose a villain in a dramatic reveal. I didn't get a public apology or a headline or validation that would make the experience feel neat. What I got was something quieter and harder to explain. I got to stay. That's it. I stayed employed. I stayed credible. I stayed visible long enough for the facts to catch up to the narrative that had been written about me. And I learned how easily that could have gone the other way. If I hadn't seen that Slack channel, if I hadn't documented instead of reacting, if I hadn't pushed back without raising my voice, if I hadn't understood that panic was the outcome they were counting on. That's the part people underestimate. Systems like this don't collapse because someone is cruel. They hold because someone remains calm. I think about that whenever someone tells me they're probably overthinking things at work. Overthinking is rarely the problem. Underrecording is. Looking back, what still unsettles me isn't what Kevin did or what Meridian allowed. It's how reasonable it all sounded when stripped of context. Concern for well-being, cultural sensitivity, duty of care, risk management, all words that sound protective, all words that can be bent. That's why I don't tell this story as a warning about bad bosses or toxic coworkers. Those are easy to spot in hindsight. I tell it because most professional harm doesn't come from obvious hostility. It comes from rooms where everyone sounds calm, emails that sound neutral, processes that sound responsible, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already far from home, trying to defend yourself in a narrative you didn't write. If there's one thing Tokyo taught me, it's this. Never assume the system knows who you are. It only knows what's been documented. And never confuse being supported with being protected. Those are not the same thing. I didn't get revenge. I didn't need it. The consequences unfolded on their own timelines. Quietly, imperfectly, inevitably. What I got instead was control. Over my record. Over my voice. Over when I speak and when I don't. That's not something a Slack channel can take away. Sometimes I wonder how many people listening to this have felt that shift. That moment where something at work stopped feeling right, but you couldn't explain why. Where support felt conditional. Where reassurance came with an edge you couldn't name. If that's you, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to say this. Pay attention early. Write things down. And trust patterns more than promises. Because the most damaging decisions about your career are rarely announced. They're discussed quietly, somewhere you're not invited. And the difference between disappearing and staying visible is often just one thing. Proof. If this story captivated you, make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes workplace drama, real-life betrayal, and human stories that unfold just like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. So I'm curious. If you were in my position, sitting in that hotel room in Tokyo, staring at a Slack channel that explained everything too late, what would you have done next? And how many people do you think never get the chance to ask that question at all?